Hi, I'm ludically. Today I'd like to talk about how Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice recaptures the feeling of myth in an interactive medium. Hellblade is a really interesting game that frames Nordic myth from a different perspective from the likes of Jotun, in that it does not romanticize the practice of Viking raids or the Nordic pantheon. It tells the story of a Celtic warrior, Senua, who journeys into the realms of the dead to bring back her lover. However, Senua suffers from forms of psychosis which manifest in hallucinations and whispers in her head, which make her already difficult task nightmarish. It is explored here that mythic narrative relies on a certain amount of imagination, ambiguity, and mysticism, which is difficult to achieve in a medium like video games because of their systemic nature. They rely on rules of behaviour and the quantification of actions. However, Hellblade recaptures the feeling of a mythic narrative by obfuscating the systems upon which the game exists. To look at myth and how it functions in different media, I want to quickly talk about a really interesting academic article by Kevin Shute. In this, Shute explores how different media forms like literature, film and games can take the same narrative world and arrive at different results. To do this, he uses the mythic narrative of Lord of the Rings as an example. He first identifies the myth as an abstract stylistic approach to stories concerning the pan-human experience. These stories are divorced from the everyday human experience and excel in the creation of imaginary worlds and characters. Myths can blend reality and fiction to form cautionary tales, as in the case of Daedalus and Icarus, where the former likely existed as an inventor and craftsman in Crete. However, using bird feathers to fly might be outside the realms of engineering possibility in the Bronze Age. By abstracting the reality of the narrative world and leveraging mystical story components, the myth provides a fresh experience of fundamental human characteristics. Within the work of Tolkien, mystical and fantastical elements are hidden from the reader, which invokes the power of imagination to fill the gaps. For example, the Balrog in Lord of the Rings is shrouded in mystery and metaphor, which only heightens its possible power. However, Shute identifies that in the film version of Lord of the Rings, mystical components of this narrative world, like orcs or the Balrog, are rendered with much more precision. Because film is an audiovisual medium, it represents concepts with accuracy and detail. Though language can be used in great detail, it is ambiguous and ultimately relies on the imagination of the reader or listener to construct the visual component. Literature then lends itself to the construction of mythic narratives because of this ambiguity and the reliance on imagination. Video games, however, take things a step further than audiovisual representation. Shute notes that mythic narratives in video games must, in addition to audiovisually representing the narrative world, construct a systematic representation. The game system is built on rules of behaviour which determine collisions with the environment, damage dealt by attacks, or health points of NPCs. Looking at the example of Lord of the Rings Online here, we can see that the Lore Master character class is representationally and functionally modelled after characters like Gandalf. Their functionality addresses the mystical powers of Gandalf and explicitly quantifies it. Because each action made by these mythic characters is quantified, the sense of mystery and mysticism over their powers deteriorates. The myth is made reality. This brings us to Hellblade and how, despite it being a video game, it recaptures the feeling of myth. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is a third-person narrative action game from Ninja Theory, the developers of the Devil May Cry remake and Enslaved Odyssey to the West. Senua's journey to the underworld of Nordic mythology is fraught with combat and perspective puzzles. Combat requires the player to dodge and attack undead Viking raiders, whilst the puzzles require the player to find runes hidden in the environment by changing their perspective towards embedded objects. Combat can be difficult as there are several different enemy types and timing is so important for parries. Combat is further complicated when Senua is surrounded and attacked from all sides. Having said that, failure is not a certainty in the game. Careful dodges, blocks and parries can reward the player with survival. Ninja Theory have adapted mythic storytelling to fit with the video game medium. The character of Druth recites stories of Nordic myth in relation to characters Senua is pursuing, like Valravn and Surt. Though they function as audio diaries, within the context of the game world, they are instances of oral storytelling, requiring the imagination of the player to visually construct them. In addition to this oral storytelling, there is very little explicit communication within Hellblade. It uses diegetic information and the whispers that Senua hears to guide the player. Much is left to the experimentation and exploration of the player. The perspective puzzles, though systematically defined, are always framed and presented ambiguously. By removing almost all explicit communication over how its game system functions, Hellblade provides a mysterious and ambiguous game world to play in. However, it is what happens when the player falls in combat that is of interest here. When the player character dies, they respawn before the combat, and their failure is framed as a vision of a potential future. These visions have a cost though. Each time the player character fails, black tendrils will steadily creep further up Senua's arm. If they reach Senua's face, then the game will end and any progress will be deleted. It is not communicated to the player exactly how many deaths will result in this final game over. Their presence in this game world is afforded by an unknown number of lives. In a medium where information concerning the number of chances a player has is explicitly communicated, Hellblade breaks the mold by purposely obfuscating this information. If we think of the concept of numbered lives in games, we can observe their prominence on the screen. The information is important for the player to know how many chances they have. This information was vitally important in earlier Mario games, with latter examples adding a safety net in the hub world and game saves. Whilst Hellblade increases the tension of each combat encounter with this obfuscation, it also serves the atmosphere and world building in the game. Death becomes another form of the mythic narrative in Hellblade. That information on the game system is hidden from the player is crucial to the game's mythic narrative. It provides an example of a video game shrouding its functional nature to deliver an ambiguous and mystical experience. By obfuscating its internal workings, Hellblade takes its simulation of combat and storytelling and turns it into one of the best mythic narratives in video games. Thanks so much for watching. Next week I'll be talking about the complexity of moral choice in Subsurface Circular, so if you'd like to be notified when this video is released, then click on the subscribe button below.